Hello, everybody. My name is Brandon Knapp here, and I want to welcome you to. I suppose it's kind of a random video of sorts, even though, at least in this case, it's. I mean, it is still pretty random. I will admit it is a bit random, but so here, as a, I can't even say a gift. I got this when I was still finishing up high school. This is a book called "The Intimate Lives of the Founding Fathers," and it's by an author named Thomas Fleming. And I thought it was you. I thought, just for I guess maybe a bit of fun or just to do something different, I'm going to probably in sections. I'm going to say read the chapters because there's basically six books or six parts of this whole story. I'm going to say we have like book one with George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton. Hold on. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Basically, it's you could call it basically say it's six chapters, except they labeled as it's six different books, but it's basically six chapters in the book, basically. So the first one, and there's going to be a part I'm sure I'm going to stop at, but anyway. So I'm going to read the introduction part, and then, and sorry, I'm sure you can see how awkward the mic is right now, but that's because for some reason the half that would hold it in is being really stupid right now. So actually, you know what? Let me just. Oh, this is going to be so cumbersome. God damn it. Um, I need to fix this crap, dude. Seriously, I need to fix this. Actually, hold on. All right, sorry about that. I think I got the issue fixed. Thanks to my dad, he fixed the microphone, so basically to where it won't fall over anymore, unless it happens again, of course. So anyway, as I was saying, so let's begin the reading, which took a lot longer than I anticipated to even start. Introduction, and again, remember this is by Thomas Fleming. This is his book, "The Intimate Lives of the Founding Fathers." Thomas Fleming, authors of The Perils of Peace. So there you go. Introduction. With leaks and wandering emails, talk shows, and tell-all aides, the private lives of today's politicians seem to have become public property. Whether this may eventually unravel the republic is frequently debated in the media. Not a few columnists and late night gurus maintain that the best and brightest are now loath to enter politics. Still, the number of politicians has not noticeably declined, nor are we the first generation to take a more than passing interest in the personal lives of our elected leaders. Convicted that historical perspective might be the best answer to the Gotten-Dämmerung tone the discussion sometimes takes, I decided to explore the roles of women in the lives of the first group of American politicians to win fame: George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. So remember, keep in mind, I'm going to do these in sections more than likely. So the first one will be about George Washington, then it will be Benjamin Franklin. Next, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, and so on. Anyways, James Madison. Collectively, most historians agree these are the founding fathers, the men who made the greatest contribution to the birth of the nation. I was soon watching a young George Washington riven with desire for the wife of his close friend. I stood with Thomas Jefferson at the bedside of his dying wife, Martha Wales, as he sobbed a faithful promise that he would never marry again. I saw a youthful Alexander Hamilton imbibe a toxic mix of fear and anger in his psyche when his headstrong mother banished his hapless father from her bed. As one Jefferson biographer has remarked, every man carries on a lifelong dialogue with his mother, sometimes in his conscious mind, more often in his unconscious. Mothers have an especially strong influence in the shadowy realm of emotions. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson seem to have inherited their mother's temperaments. Some historians think John Adams' mother, Susanna Boylston Adams, was a manic depressive who passed on the illness to her favorite son. Although the women in these famous lives spoke 150 years before feminism entered the American vocabulary, their independent voices will surprise many people. And actually, I'm just gonna fast forward to because the introduction is way too long to keep reading, so I'm just gonna start off with George Washington. So this is chapter one. This is basically the start, technically the official start. Okay, the agonies of honor. On March 30th, 1877, the New York Herald, one of the largest newspapers in America, printed a lengthy love letter that had been written on September 12th, 1758. Not exactly hot news, you might say. Had the editors lost their collective marbles? The Herald's editors did not think so. Nothing they printed that day created more of a sensation among their readers. The letter was from George Washington. Here's the heart of its text, exactly as it was printed. This true, I profess myself a votary of love. I acknowledge the lady is in the case, and further, I confess that this lady is known to you. Yes, madame, as well as she is to one who is too sensible to her charms to deny the power whose influence he feels and must ever submit to. I feel the force of her amiable beauties, and the recollection of 1,000 tender passages that I could wish to obliterate till I am bid to revive them. But experience, alas, sadly reminds me how impossible this is, and invites an opinion which I have long entertained, that there is a destiny which has control of our actions, not to be resisted by the strongest efforts of human nature. You have drawn me, dear madame, and rather have I drawn myself into an honest confession of a simple fact. Misconstrue not my meaning, doubt it, nor expose it. The world has no business to know the object of my love. Give me a second. No object of my love, declared in this manner to you when I want to conceal it. One thing above all things in this world, I wish to know, and only one person of your acquaintance can solve me that, or guess my meaning. But adieu to this till happier times, if I ever shall see them. In this welter of indirection and hinted meanings was George Washington crying out, I love you, do you love me? The Herald's headline was a Washington romance. Beneath it was a subtitle, a letter from General Washington acknowledging the power of love. Then came an introduction to the text, and a collection of rare and autographed letters, which will be sold by Bangs Incorporation. This afternoon, we find the accompanying letter written by General Washington at the age of 26 and never before made public. The present owner purchased it in England some years ago for the sum of L15, which I'm assuming, not knowing much about currency in the past, I'm assuming that was some sort of currency. London or something currency. The letter is addressed to Miss Sarah Fairfax at Belvoir. This lady was a Miss Carey, to whom George Washington once offered his hand, but was refused for his friend and comrade, George William Fairfax. Irving asserts that it was a sister of Miss Fairfax, Miss Mary Carey, after Miss Edward Ambler. Irving refers to Washington Irving, author of an acclaimed 5-volume biography of Washington, but the Herald reporter dismisses Irving's assertion by citing an article that was published in Scribner's magazine in June of 1876, in which a Fairfax descendant insisted it was Sally Carey, Miss Fairfax, for whom Washington had a tenderness. He quotes from the article. It is fair to say that papers which have never been given to the public set this question beyond a doubt. Miss George William Fairfax, the object of George Washington's early and passionate love, lived to an advanced age in Bath, England. Upon her death at the age of 81, letters still in possession of the Fairfax family were found among her effects, showing that Washington had never forgotten the influence of his young, youthful disappointment. Next came a gap that underscores why newspapers are often called history's first draft. The reporter noted that in the sentences preceding the confession that he was a votary of love. Washington rebuked Sally Fairfax for suggesting in the letter to him that he was preoccupied with the uh, um, animating prospect of possessing Miss Custis. The reporter blithely dismissed this reference to Washington's future wife. It is hardly probable that Washington means to express his love for Miss Custis, for her husband was then living. In fact, did not die until 20 years after the date of this letter. Readers who had access to Washington Irving's biography swiftly discovered that Daniel Parke Custis had been dead for more than a year when Washington wrote this September 12, 1758, letter to Sally Fairfax. Worse, on or about June 5th, 1758, he had become engaged to marry Martha Dandridge Custis. For Americans who regarded George Washington as a virtual incarnation of divinity, and they were numerous in 1877, the letter created consternation. It was only 3 months after the fervent year-long celebration of the 100th anniversary of independence in which Washington had been portrayed as the ultimate hero. Today, the the Bangs auction house would have been rubbing its hands with unconcealed glee and kiting the price of the manuscript into the stratosphere. In 1877, no bidding took place. Bangs merely announced that the letter had been sold for $13. Even in 1877, the dollar was worth perhaps 30 of our deprecated dollars. The price is much too low to be believable. Rumor long maintained to support that assertion. Long maintained that the purchaser was J.P. Morgan, but no evidence has been discovered to support that assertion. Whoever he was, the buyer evidently felt he was performing a patriot act by removing the letter from sight. For the next 80 years, the original letter remained unexamined by scholars, which spurred violent arguments about its authenticity and meaning. Some people were eager to dismiss it as a forgery, but the first two collectors of Washington's papers reluctantly decided to include the newspaper text. Because the style was so unmistakably unauthentic. And no one could produce an adequate reason for forging it. Not until the late 1950s did a determined Washington biographer find the original in the files of Harvard's Houghton Library. That discovery has not prevented people from continuing to disagree over its meaning. Some historians have argued it is a good-humored joke, the sort of risque banter that men and women often exchanged in the 18th century. John C. Fitzpatrick, who spent several decades on his monumental uh, edition of Washington's papers, maintained that the letter was a paean of praise for Martha Custis. He took ferocious issue with those who said that Washington was professing his passion for Miss Fairfax, in spite of being engaged to Martha. If they were correct, Fitzpatrick wrote, every decent person would be forced to conclude that George Washington was a worthless scoundrel. Sally Carey Fairfax was the daughter of one of the wealthiest planters in Virginia, Wilson Carey, possessor of a splendid estate at Keeley's on the James River overlooking Hampton Roads, not far from Newport News. The family also enjoyed comfortable townhouses in Williamsburg and Hampton. Wilson Carey's father had been a rector of the College of William and Mary. The young man had studied there and at Trinity College in England. His houses were stocked with the latest English books. In magazines, he took pleasure in teaching Sally and her three younger sisters how to read and write French. He was one of the leaders of the colony's legislature, the House of Burgesses, which meant that each year the Careys enjoyed the brilliant social season in Williamsburg while the Burgesses were in session. It was a world of fancy balls, lavish dinners, and witty conversation that made the pursuit of happiness a fact of life long before it became a phrase in a political declaration. Um, an anecdote passed down in the Carey family gives a glimpse of Sally that suggests she was the center of male attraction at an early age. She was referring to the family's Williamsburg homes while one of the colonial wars with France was raging and the town was patrolled by sentries. One of these soldiers demanded to hear the password of the night from Sally's coachman. The man was flummoxed into silence. Sally stamped her foot and cried, "But I am Miss Sally Carey." The sentry gulped and said, "Pass." It seemed that the officer of the watch was an admirer and had made Sally Carey the password as a compliment to the young lady. At 18, Sally married George William Fairfax, son of William Fairfax, proprietor of Belvoir, on the Potomac River not far from Mount Vernon, which, if you don't know with historical context, that is the home, that was basically George Washington's home. And unfortunately, as most people remind people who try to, have a big, huge support for George Washington, that was a plantation where he owned, I believe, about 100 or maybe close to 300 slaves. I'm not 200% sure, and I'm probably really inaccurate about that, but that's allegedly the numbers of how much he owned in terms of human property, unfortunately. But as we were saying, the bride enjoyed the dizzying expectation that one day she might become not merely the mistress of this fine mansion, but the wife of a bona fide nobleman. George William stood a better than even chance of becoming the next Lord Fairfax. This would not only entitle him to sit in the House of Lords and Parliament and preside over a vast English estate, it would make him owner of 5 million acres of Northern Virginia that King Charles II had given to a maternal ancestor of Lord Fairfax in 1673. This potentially glorious future was probably the best explanation for the match. William Fairfax had sent his son to England at the age of 6 to be educated by his family, describing it as a poor West India boy. George William, was the product of a marriage that Fairfax had made in the Bahamas with the obscure widow of a George military artillery major. Someone launched the rumor that the woman had Negro blood. For 15 years, George William endured the unlovely experience of his wealthy English relatives eyeing his skin color, debating whether he was a mulatto. The result was a slight, rather timid young man with a dour, downturned mouth surrounded by a strong hooked nose and shrewd, close-set eyes. His letter to an influential Fairfax kinsman in England reporting his engagement to Sally did not exactly seize with passion. He made it sound like it was something he had worked into his schedule while attending House of Burgesses. He described Sally as an amiable person and reported that he had obtained her and her father's consent to an early marriage. He closed by noting that Colonel Carey wears the same coat of arms as Lord Hunsdon. The first Lord Hunsdon was a cousin of Queen Elizabeth, Henry Carey. This apparently was as important to George William as Sally's charms. A portrait of Sally, painted by a not very talented artist around this time, reveals a slim, dark-haired young woman who most people would call handsome rather than beautiful. But the narrow face is striking nonetheless. The deep-set dark eyes emanate a subtly mocking intelligence. The nose is strong and the mouth firm and confident. Her waist is narrow and her bosom ample. It is hard not to imagine her as the leader of some lively revels. Sally came to Belvoir as a bride in 1748 and soon met 16-year-old George Washington. He was a frequent guest at nearby Mount Vernon, where his older half-brother, Lawrence, was happily married to Anne Fairfax, George William's older sister. Lawrence was doing his utmost to rescue George, already 6 feet tall, from the clutches of his headstrong widowed mother, Mary Ball Washington, who was trying to convert her oldest son into a surrogate husband and father figure for her four younger children. That's weird to think about, that George Washington's own mother was trying to, in I guess a weird way, make him into a father figure and a husband to, I hope not his own mother, because that's, ugh. George's father, Augustine Washington, had died in 1743 when George was 11. Later, George mournfully remarked that he had only a blurred recollection of this huge, muscular man, a sort of Hercules, famous for his feats of strength. For much of the time, Augustine had been an absentee father, traveling between his scattered farms and an iron works that required a great deal of his attention. Enterprise was in Augustine Washington's blood. Since the arrival of the first Washington in 1657, a refugee from the English Civil War, the males had made a habit of marrying well and acquiring land. Augustine Washington had continued this tradition, expanding his holdings from 1,740 acres at the time of his first marriage to almost 11,000 acres at his death. Compared with the Careys, the Birds, the Lees, and the Randolphs, and the other first families of Virginia, the Washingtons remained middling gentry. Their house on a 250-acre ferry farm across the Rappahannock River from Fredericksburg, where George grew up, was an 8-room frame structure not even faintly comparable to the stately brick mansions such as Robert Carter's Nominee Hall or William Byrd's Westover. Augustine Washington owned 49 slaves. Robert King Carter had over 600 toiling on his 60,000 acres. Jesus. It is easy to imagine young George Washington's awe when he visited Belvoir. Elegant English-made couches, chairs, and tables filled the parlor. At Ferry Farm, the parlor contained 3 beds. George's mother, Mary Ball, was Augustine Washington's second wife. Her mother was illiterate, and Mary received no education worth mentioning. She was physically imposing, large and vigorous, with an explosive temper. One described her as majestic. One of George's boyhood playmates said he was 10 times more afraid of her than he was of his own parents. One day, Mary stood up in her carriage on Fredericksburg Main Street and cursed and lashed a slave because he had mishandled the horse. As her oldest son, George, was exposed at an early age to his mother's tantrums, worse, he inherited her violent temper. There are more than a few intimations that George Washington's home life with this turbulent woman was unhappy before as well after his father's death. Second marriages, especially ones in which children of the first wife must be dealt with, are often uneasy. Augustine Washington's decision to send his 2 sons by his first marriage, Augustine and Lawrence, to school in England at considerable expense, may have been motivated in part by Mary's sharp tongue and short temper. In one of his boyhood notebooks, in which George laboriously copied such things as rules of civility and decent behavior in company, he included in his strong, firm script a poem, True Happiness. It was a portrait of domestic tranquility. The truly blessed enjoy a good estate with productive soil, a warm fire, the hearth, a simple diet, constant friends, a healthy body and healthy mind and body, and a quiet wife, a quiet soul. Almost certainly, this portrait was the opposite of what George encountered on Ferry Farm, where, were it not for the intervention of Lawrence Washington, it is dismaying to think what George Washington might have become. And so we're at 25 minutes. So either if it cuts off or I stop at some point, I will continue then and we get a part two of it. 14 years older than George, Lawrence had inherited Vernon from his father. His marriage to Anne Fairfax, William Fairfax's daughter, had catapulted him from middling gentry into the heady stratosphere of Virginia's aristocracy. Fairfax was the cousin and land agent for the sixth Lord Fairfax, who owned those 5 million acres between the Potomac and Rappahannock rivers. Virginians had done everything in their power to invalidate Charles II's generosity, but the courts had upheld the royal prerogative, thereby making Fairfax the most influential name in Virginia. In swift succession after his marriage, Lawrence became adjutant of the Virginia militia and a member of the House of Burgesses. At the polish of his English education is love of martial glory, and it is easy to see how he became a formidable figure on young George's horizon. Thanks to Lawrence, George became a close friend of George William Fairfax. 7 years older than George, Fairfax accepted the elongated teenager as a companion at fox hunts at Belvoir and on trips to Shenandoah Valley, where more Fairfax acres were being surveyed for sale. Under his genteel influence, Washington was soon spending the money he earned as a surveyor on stylish clothes and feeling at ease in the elegant atmosphere of Belvoir. To Mary Ball's mounting exasperation, George spent more and more of his time on the banks of the Potomac. Then came tragedy. Lawrence Washington was stricken with tuberculosis and slowly died before George's grief-stricken eyes. In a desperate attempt to regain his health, Lawrence journeyed to the island of Barbados with George, hoping a winter spent in warm sunshine might restore him. The experiment proved fruitless for Lawrence and doubtfully painful for George. He caught a bad case of smallpox, which he barely survived. Lawrence was so generous to his younger brother in death, as he had been in life. He named George to the heir of the Mount Vernon estate if Anne Fairfax Washington predecessed him. In the meantime, George leased the house and lands from her for a modest sum. When Anne died in 1761, he became Mount Vernon's owner. Mount Vernon was young George's refuge from Mary, and nearby Belvoir was a place where he met some of the most sophisticated young women in Virginia. Sally, Carrie, Fairfax's sisters, and numerous friends were frequent visitors. George soon proved himself more than vulnerable to their charms. One belle, who remained nameless, inspired some of the worst poetry ever committed by an adolescent. "Oh, ye gods, why should my poor restless heart stand to oppose thy might and power, at last to surrender to Cupid's feathered dart, and now lays bleeding every hour for her that's pitiless of my grief and woes, and will not on me pity take." This atrocity may have been committed on behalf of a lowland beauty who particularly tormented George. He told his friend Robin during a sojourn in the Shenandoah Valley at Lord Fairfax's hunting lodge that there was an agreeable young lady living in the house, but every time he looked at her, he thought of the lowland beauty which was only adding fuel to the fire. There seems to be little doubt that George was powerfully attracted to the opposite sex, hardly surprising for a healthy, vigorous teenager. George's romantic emotions slowly acquired a darker tinge. Sally Fairfax seemed to have been a coquette who tantalized, teased, and dominated the men around her. She soon realized that one of her conquests was George Washington, a discovery that did not displease her. The contrast between the tall, muscular Washington and her short, precise courtier husband, whose great talents was assiduous flattery at his superiors, could not have been more complete. As they performed together in amateur theatrics, danced minuets in Belvoir's ballroom, and exchanged gossip about the amorous doings of the contemporaries, George Washington fell violently in love with his close friend's wife. One of their favorite plays was Cato, written by the celebrated essayist and poet Joseph Addison in 1713. It was the most popular drama of the century. More to the point, it had two parts made to order for lovers and would-be lovers. Marcia was Cato's devoted daughter. Juba was a North African warrior who rallied to Cato's side when he resisted the rise of Julius Caesar. Marcia confessed her love for Juba, but Cato refused his approval because he was a mere colonial. Juba nevertheless remained devoted to the untouchable beauty. By the time George realized what was happening to him emotionally, he was on his way to becoming Virginia's best-known soldier. Grown to his full 6'2" and 1/2 inches, he stood, in the words of one eyewitness, as straight as an Indian. Thanks to his Fairfax connections, he was appointed a major of the militia at age 20. The following year, he won a skirmish against a French patrol that had become the opening shots of the world's first global conflict, the 7 Years' War. Next, in spite of strenuous objections from his mother, George became a favorite aide of British General Edward Braddock, and miraculously survived the rout of his army of regulars when they marched into West Pennsylvania to oust the French from Fort Duquesne, where Pittsburgh now stands. Ignoring 4 bullets through his coat and 2 horses killed under him, Washington was among the few who distinguished himself on that chaotic battlefield. He staggered back to Mount Vernon, a very tired man. A letter from William Fairfax revealed how closely the residents of Belvoir followed Washington's military career. Your safe return becomes an uncommon joy to us, and will no doubt be sympathized by all lovers of heroic virtue. End quote. To us, and will no doubt. Fairfax wrote. He hoped Saturday night's rest would refresh the weary warrior enough to enable him to come to Belfort in the morning. Sally added a saucy note, consigned by two visiting women friends, accusing the hero of quote, great unkindness in not visiting us this night. I assure you that nothing but being satisfied that our company would be disagreeable would prevent us from trying if our legs would not carry us to Mount Vernon this night. But if you will not come to us tomorrow morning very early, we shall be at Mount Vernon. End quote. This is a letter from a woman who knows she has a certain gentleman virtually at her beck and call. Washington soon became the colonel of a regiment of Virginia regulars that struggled to defend the 700-mile-long frontier against French and Indian incursions. And actually, at this moment, I'm going to stop and then start another recording because I see we're at 33 minutes, and I don't know how it works too well in terms of if you get cut off, so I'm going to try to avoid that. So I'm just going to, for me, myself, I'm literally just going to stop it right now. Just give me a second. Yeah, I'm just going to stop this right here, and I'm going to start up again.